It's Monday, September 13th, 2021. May we have a roll call, please?
Sure. Member Rappin?
Here.
Member Ryder?
Here.
And Chair Inkman.
Here. Okay, the first order of business is approval of the minutes from the March 22nd, 2021 meeting. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
Okay. Any corrections or updates to the minutes?
No, ma'am.
Okay, hearing none. All in favor, or do I need to do roll call?
You do not.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, the minutes are approved. Next, we have some time available for any non-agenda items or visitors to the meeting. The Finance Committee allocates 15 minutes at this time for any individuals who would like the opportunity to address the committee on any matter that is not listed on the agenda. I see that we don't have anybody in the room, but digitally, do we have anybody tuning in who would like to?
Yeah, Bettina, I can't see anybody right now. If there's anybody else participating, I don't think there are, but can you double check?
Sure. No, there's no one in the room.
Okay, thank you. So,
Sure.
Okay, great. So next, we're on to the informational items, and the first is the Moody's 2021 Annual Issuer Report. Bettina, do you want to share some highlights from that?
Sure. The Moody's report was submitted back to us, and we still have my AAA rating. Of note, to highlight for the board, the 75.3% percent of operating revenues that's reflected in the report. Looking at this year's audit that we have a draft of, it looks like we're headed towards about 90% this year with the revenues that we've received and some of the reductions that we made. Overall, in general, the report's pretty much the same as it has been in years past. Nothing really significant to note unless someone has a specific question.
Nope, I read it, and, you know, the only thing that caught my eye is the underfunded pension. We all know about that, but otherwise, really proud of the financial status of Lake Bluff.
yeah, and Bettina, could you comment on that?
Sure.
Rappin comment, we had a conversation about earlier today about the status of the pension funding.
So, unfortunately for everyone that had an April 30th end date last year, pension funding numbers went down significantly based on the market at that time. So fortunately this year we've rebounded, and the tentative draft from the village actuary will put us at about 65% funded, which is a significant increase, and probably I think the highest number we've been at that I know of historically. So that's a good swing. Hopefully it'll stay that way. Right now market seems to be trending good on the investments for this pension fund this year too. So.
Bettina, did you say that we hit a blip, a bad market relative to the general market has done so well? How is that possible?
Well, so April 30th is the ending date from last year's valuation. So the snapshot occurred at a point in time when our investment income had significantly reduced.
2020, April 2020 is the relevant.
Got it.
Right.
Okay.
So
I
last
that market.
So, right. So this year's valuation for the current
Timing's
number
everything.
looks back to 21 and significantly different number.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sure.
In terms of just an overview of how we fund our pension, we know that, you know, we have advisors and actuaries who give a lot of time and study to what that future liability is and the point in time in which we're mandated to have, you know, a fund level equal to, you know, what's being told to us. And, you know, there's different strategies, and we have been consistent in applying the strategies that we've used. And, you know, from time to time, people will say, well, why don't we just take a lump sum and kind of attack that at a different rate? What would you say in response to a funding strategy like that?
So a one-time lump contribution would increase obviously for that 1 year. what your funding levels look like. But long term, you'd need to really be making that consistent additional contribution for a period of years, because this is a forward-looking process that is going to be affected by rates of return each year, not just for any one given year. So although an extra contribution is nice, it would really need to be over a longer period of years, just like, you know, paying down a mortgage payment. Although the mortgage doesn't fluctuate with the market, this has a lot of other factors involved to it in addition. So it would need to be for a lengthy period of time that you did that contribution or had a different strategy. And that's why people look to change either their rate of return on a calculation with the actuary. So if you lowered your rate of return, that would create a higher contribution for the next years, and that would just push forward and, you know, create a higher tax levy for that contribution. So those are ways that numbers
Adjust the
can be
mortality
changed.
tables, yeah.
Right, mortality table changes will also change it. And then we've also had changes in our demographics with newer police officers, younger ones that are tier 1 versus tier 2, so that all those dynamics change the way the calculation works and how we get to our number. So just to recap, if you were looking at a long-term additional contribution, that would have to change, but not a one-time.
Right, so it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. It's steady and methodical, and that's what we've done, but we've also been, you know, tweaking as we go along, as, you know, as the factors change.
Right,
So-
correct.
Well, thank you for that.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
It isn't 65%, albeit better than 54, underfunded. It's still red zone, is it not? So instead of one time, what is the calculation that would be required to get it higher, and instead of a one-time lump sum, just increase? Because about a year ago this time, the Finance Committee was talking about this very issue, and I'm trying to figure out how to contribute another $100,000 a year or so. It seems, from what I gleaned from the minutes anyway, I wasn't at the meeting. I'm just
Sure.
curious how we can get it into a maybe orange, if not green, but 65 is still red zone, if I'm not mistaken.
So it's 65% funded through the total 2040.
2040.
So that's the target date that they're looking at on having pensions funded at 90% funded.
Okay.
So they want you to grow to that number, and in doing so, the actuary calculates a number that will get you to that number actuarially. At least that's the intent. There's a lot of speculation on what will happen when the consolidation occurs, which will bring all of our funding together as of 2022.
Right, in June, right?
January, and how that will come together. You know, their model has been more of a, you know, IMRF model, if you will, that will get us hopefully to, you know, a flat 7.5% rate of return. And as a group, collectively, obviously, that will get us closer to each of our funding numbers if we pull together. So, you know, there's a lot of moving parts to, you know, what we could do. Not to say that we can't revisit the question, but to give you a definite answer would require an actuary. I mean, there's a lot of different parts to that answer.
Right.
Sorry.
No, not at all. No apology needed. I was just trying to understand how we get it, because I know IMRF is almost 100% funded. So I was just trying to figure out how we could get this. And I understand, actuarially speaking, we have younger police officers, but nevertheless, as people retire and go into payment status. And I know that I see the 90% is future, and certainly that could change, that future date could be changed. But I'm just wondering, because the Moody's report says that the total, the net pension liability to operating revenue is unfavorably higher than the US median. So I'm just wondering if we were to increase the contribution to the pension, if that would improve that outlook at all. And
I mean,
if that's something anybody's talking.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it wouldn't. So, you know, anytime you throw extra money at something, it should help. But I'm leery to say that it will get you a lot higher than you know anticipated, just because there's so many variables to what could happen.
Right, and isn't there also a restriction on equities investments? I mean, could you talk a little bit about how restrictive the investment choices are for the pension fund versus something else?
Well, fortunately, we've exceeded the $10 million threshold, so our restrictions are not that of what they were, 4 or 5 years ago. So we can invest in corporates and do some of the things at the larger, it's considered a larger fund. So our investments changed a couple years ago to not be as restrictive as they were. I'm not really sure how to give you more information on what you're looking at.
No, that's fine. That's helpful. I wasn't aware that there was a threshold amount. So it's
Yeah.
good to know that there had been changes made to what you could invest in.
Right, and once you hit that $10 million threshold, even if you were to slip beneath it, once you've made that mark, you don't change your investment strategy.
Okay, thank you, Bettina.
Sure.
So I have a question about, because I'm very novice at that type of financial activity. So what, right now it's 65.4, 65.1, what would be the correct funding at this point, Bettina? If you were to choose to say, okay, given that we have to be funded by 2040, what would be the better number than 64%, 65%?
I don't know, President Charlo, I don't know that there's a direct answer to that question. Obviously, you want to see the rate increase and not decrease and not show declines. That would be, as we progress through, that's the steady answer. I don't know that there's a magic number that I could say, oh, we should be at 80% today, and that would get us to 100. It really doesn't work that way. It depends on the pool of employees. It depends on
The target date.
the target date,
Yeah.
which historically has been moved.
Yeah.
There's been talk of that. So there's a lot of variables, and I can't really give you that definite answer.
Thank you. No, I heard you very well when you were talking about the different variables, about the edge of a pool and the target date and the rate of return of a market, of course. And so, but I was curious to see if you had a better slider to actually achieve a goal. That's all. Thank you.
And we, and not to belabor the topic, but the idea that one of the biggest elements is the robustness of the benefit schedule, right? And that really drives a lot of this, in which this body or the police pension board doesn't decide. That's decided down in Springfield, and that's been a big complaint. And over the years, this body has authorized resolutions to say that the state legislature should take immediate steps to reduce the benefit schedules associated with public safety pensions, and that's been supported at a policy level over the years because that is a very critical piece of the equation. But again, you guys don't control that, so.
And one other, and Bettina, you can help me on this if I'm not remembering it right. When we did that snapshot 1 year ago and the market was down because everything was down because COVID, that meant that when we took that picture of, well, what are all of our assets worth, they were down, and it was kind of a lower percentage based on the end target, which didn't change, just what we were valuing it at. And so that required of us, given those complex calculations with many, many variables, it's not one variable, two variables, many variables. And it said, okay, now you have to contribute X, and that's determined by the actuary. And because it was such a low point in time, in comparing it to a previous year, all of a sudden it's 100,000 more. And that was, I think that was last year there was this $100,000 comment. It was suddenly surprising, like, why do we suddenly have to do something more? What have you done that is so not forward thinking? And it's like, no, it's a snapshot in time. These are the complex calculations. This is what you need to fund so that you end up here. And then it's kind of a blessing and a curse because you are required to contribute more. It's more in the pot that can continue to grow and mature, and hopefully, if it's good returns. If it's bad returns, then you invested a lot and it didn't grow and mature. So you have to everything has to be long-term. And when you just look at a snapshot or you just looked at a short window, it's easy to say, oh, why didn't you see that coming? Or why did you do that? You have to have the long haul in mind.
Right, which to me sort of begs the question, why not contribute more to reach the target goal sooner?
Well, it's risk. I mean, what if we're in the part where, we think, hey, it's just about to take off? It could or it could not.
Right, I mean,
So it's a
there's-
slow and a steady approach evenly throughout to spread that risk out over many different cycles and many different markets. And
Right, we're gonna have a 15% correction probably in October, so I understand that. And I think that's pretty much agreed across the board by most analysts. But we're thinking about 2040, and I'm trying to figure out why you wouldn't fill your silo sooner as opposed to later. I guess
well,
that's
we
what I'm
just,
trying to.
we just go to the actuaries who are,
Okay.
that's what they
and
do.
they would
There's
advise-
other municipalities that are at 85%.
Well, that's a function of their history,
Okay.
right?
So we're making up for things done in the past, I'm just trying to get a sense of where we
Well,
are.
we're
This is-
unique in terms of our makeup, in terms of how many, people.
Size of the force.
You're right. I mean,
Every
Lake Bluff
place is
is
different.
very unique, we're very small, and we have you know what I mean? Like, we have, so we're a function of all those things, and so,
Right.
anyway.
But for the same reason, like you said, why can't we double down? Like, had we doubled down a year ago, maybe that'd have been a very bad thing, right? And so like this burden on this particular group of residents now versus spreading out the cost over long-term, because the village has taken revenues from the from the property tax to pay off this identified, that's the stream of revenue to pay for this activity.
Based on just investment strategies, I'm not sure that I agree with that, but, okay.
Actuaries have said and advised against doing a general lump sum payment over the,
Oh, no, I'm not talking about lump sum, I'm just talking about overall increases. I think we're at 800 and some $1,000 a year, is that right?
Well, we'll be tweaking and listening to, what the actuaries say, and, saying, what do we think is reasonable for us at this point in time?
Have we been investing at that level, the 875 consistently, or is that an increased number versus previous?
I think the methodologies have changed over the years. I mean, and, one annual contribution, I don't have a chart of what the annual contributions were,
Sure.
but it wasn't,
How is it decided year to year what the contributions are?
So the actual, I'm sorry.
Oh, it's through the actuaries. Oh, I see.
yes.
Okay. So the actuaries are not pushing us to catch up in any way, shape, or form?
Well, the actuarial minimum is, at least according to last year, was $611,000, and our contributions exceed 800.
Okay.
So we're exceeding it.
Yep.
What I'm thinking of is the percentage, because of where it puts you, and I get it, we're relying on actuarial tables. I'm just trying to flesh out, because this is what people have expressed concern about to me.
Right.
Why we're not contributing more. And I understand there's a risk profile, and we're trying to balance those things. I just need answers so I can go back to people and say, this is what, in the, like.
Well, actuarially, last year's contribution was 849, 850, and this year, the actuarial calculation shows a $927,000 contribution. So, I mean, they're increasing. It's not that they're not increasing it. It's also a matter of how much we can, how much more could we pay?
Right, and then also, you're right, Bettina, you mentioned how much you realize from that increased investment, because you have to get a consistent return on those dollars in order to increase the percentage funded.
Right.
Okay.
So the actuarial tables is trying to get us to the end point, which is 100% by 2040.
90.
And they've given us
90, we're mandated to be at 90%.
90% by 2040.
Right.
Right, and so that makes sense.
And we're not predicating that at all on the assumption that this will be, the date will be changed. They're using that as a hard date, right?
Right. No, they're not.
Okay, just because it's Illinois, so.
Right. And there is a consolidation happening. So obviously,
Yeah.
things will likely change, but they're based on whatever the current standard is.
Okay.
I think this has been a really helpful conversation. It feels relevant in terms of just everybody kind of understanding the big picture. So I love all the questions, and they're, the only bad question is the one that you wanted to ask and you were afraid to ask. So thank you for asking all of those questions. So any more comments regarding pension funding? Okay, we do have a number of other items on the agenda. So after Moody's, I'm going to go back to my agenda. All right, the IMET American Rescue Plan deposits. There was some information about the availability of using this IMET fund. Bettina, do you want to share a little bit more about that?
I don't know that there's a whole lot more to share other than I'm really interested in segregating the funds similar to what we do to MFT, which was kind of summarized in the cover memo. Easier to track and easier to show balances and hopefully tie them to future expenditures. And it's a very liquid fund. We already have an account with them. It's just a matter of establishing one for the ARPA money.
Right, so it's just a tool that we can use that just helps us to better track, and it's got a maturity window that matches what we need to keep track of so that we're using the funds in accordance to what we're mandated to do. Any other thoughts or questions regarding that? Okay.
I did have a question earlier from Member Ryder regarding availability of these funds for another item on this same informational item report regarding the streetscapes. You know, why wasn't ARPA funds listed there? And the question, and Bettina, you want to answer that?
Sure. So as of today, the direction is that ARPA funds need to, whether you use them for public safety, salary replacement, revenue replacement, they need to fall into the specific categories of capital infrastructure for water, sewer, or broadband. So while we receive those funds, we need to use them for a qualifying project. That's the direction I've received to date. If I hear something different, I will let you know.
Fantastic, thank you.
Sure.
And is there any time by which we need to spend it?
Yeah,
So needs to be spent by,
2024.
plans have to be into effect by 2024 and spent by 2025.
And I'm curious, did we incur premium pay for essential workers during the COVID
We did not.
offset? I didn't expect so. Okay.
A lot of that premium pay is being put into the plan so that people can look back retrospectively and give people some sort of premium pay that receive it before as a way to qualify the funds.
I see.
So I have a question for you. We are preparing ourselves for studies for water, stormwaters, thank you. I've been thinking about that night and day, and I just forgot the word. So wouldn't that be a fine item to pay for the studies, to basically plan for the work we want to do in the village?
I think it could be. I think that's part of the memo, very subtly placed, I think. It was the idea that this, that the conversation about how the ARPA monies would be programmed would be part of this upcoming budget conversation.
Okay.
So you guys will have a chance to do that soon, and just in the short term, we're going to park the money here, and we'll have that conversation, but that is a qualifying expenditure, yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
I have another question. We referenced the payment of 370 some odd thousand as a first tranche. Do we expect a second or a third?
So the regulations are that 12 months from the date of the first payment, you will receive your second payment. So yes, that's a given. It should come 12 months from the first one. So next September, we should get another 378,000.
We expect it to be the same amount as far as we know?
Yes, they're divided in half equally.
They're divided in half?
All right. I think we are ready to move on to, thank you for those really good questions. The purchasing policy update. Drew, do you want to address the changes that were made or suggested, shall we say?
Yeah, I actually defer to Bettina.
Okay. Sorry, Bettina.
Sorry. No, it's okay. Sorry. So I included the purchasing policy that we have that was effective 2009. And, you know, overall, there's a lot of dated language in it related to procedures and policies that need to get cleaned up with that just aren't relevant to even how we do business. And insofar as like purchase orders, for example, we have purchase orders that are required for everything over $1,000, which creates a lot of extra paperwork and a lot of extra steps for staff when most purchase order authority levels are sitting somewhere between $3,000, $4,000, or $5,000. So assuming that all those expenditures are still budgeted and they've been approved, it isn't that they haven't, it's just the extra step of purchase order we need to reevaluate. So some policies and procedures, and then the authorization levels, just to bring them current with pricing that exists today, so that department heads could approve up to the same as the purchase level authority. So that's a really quick overview. Given the go-ahead, I would come back with a red line version or an entirely new one potentially to compare to and from, to show you all the changes that we're looking at making, but just wanted some direction in the existing initial larger things that I could do.
Related to the approval levels, the chart that compared all of the villages is really, really helpful. And it looks like, for department head, manager, and governing board, we're very consistent. I guess these are newly proposed, right? For Lake Bluff?
Right.
The only outlier is the first one, the 3 quotes require. We're a little bit of an outlier on the higher end. So can you talk about the 5,000 versus 10,000, how that recommendation came to be, what the rationale is?
So the $5,000 to $10,000 for department head?
No, well, 3 quotes required. I personally, I'm comfortable with the department head, the manager, and the governing board. It's really 3 quotes required.
Okay, so I'm sorry, what's the
The
question?
first column. The first
It's the first column in that blue chart on, it doesn't have a page number.
Oh, the 3 quotes required?
Yep.
48.
49.
So it's just to meet the authorization levels. We don't need to do that. We can leave it at 5, that's fine. If that's the direction and the preference, it's not a problem.
I was just noting that it seems a little bit of an outlier. It looks like the range is generally between 1,000 and 5,000.
Right.
Drew, do you have any specific, does this just make everybody's life easier? And
I think it is. I mean, that comes down to its administrative ease.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, obviously things have gone, everything keeps going up in price. Things, what it costs today to order silliest items seems to be more and more expensive all the time. So I don't think it's going to make or break our operations if you leave it at 5, is the honest truth, but it's just an administrative ease.
And I can certainly have the policy direct people, regardless of the threshold, to still get, 3 prices, online or quotes or things, at least to check pricing, which is still part of the policy, but not a direct, quote from the
Says
vendor.
it's at 10.
Yeah, that's the proposed. So
Right.
it's currently at 5. So just last question on this, and I'm
Currently
kind of
5.
beating a dead horse, but do we have a lot of quotes in the $5,000 to $10,000 range, or is that really far and few between? Are they mostly bigger?
They're mostly bigger. They're mostly related to contracts and projects. We don't have a lot of individual purchases that qualify unless we get into technology, and then we rely on our consortium, and they do get pricing
Yeah.
for us.
I'm in support of 10,000 being a limit. I'm comfortable with that, but I would defer also to Susan and Barbara.
That's a great question in terms of quantity. There's not a lot. I just went through my head of author. I just don't see a lot of those.
Okay.
I have a question.
yeah,
Because
just-
page 49 of that blue table, again, I looked at it earlier on, I read that memo earlier on, and I thought it was, even though I would agree with the levels you guys are proposing, I think that table is a little bit misleading because we compare ourselves to much larger communities. So Lake Forest is 5 times larger than us. Highland Park is probably even larger than that, but yet they have the same levels of spending. So I do understand that the items you're spending are the same items in lesser quantities. But still, that table is a little bit misleading to me, I think.
Regis, so you're saying it's a relative scale because we're a smaller community, maybe our number should be smaller because,
Well, you're still spending for the same item, but in lesser quantities.
yeah.
But from a comparison standpoint, that table might actually give the wrong impression, basically. Because we're not Lake Forest, we're not the size of Lake Forest. Literally.
So are you proposing something?
You know what, no, I'm not actually. And so I'm following your guidance.
Yeah, the closest is Northfield,
Size-wise?
right, like Waukegan's 70,000 people. I agree, that is sort of, they're just people they're communities nearby, but it is true, I wonder, like in Kenilworth and Glencoe, smaller communities. Not that it matters, we can do what we want, but
Well,
it's kind of an interesting point. The threshold is different
Well, the
some-
thing is,
much bigger
you might spend $5,000 for the same $5,000 item you might buy in Waukegan, for example, even though Waukegan is 14 times our size.
Right.
But you might not buy it, you might buy it 2 or 3 times, while they buy it 50 times. So the $5,000 threshold still applies, and I think this is a good threshold. But the comparison might be a little bit skewed here, that's all.
I think the ratio of purchases relative to staff is probably equivalent. It probably averages out, and I think we're trying to make staff's life easy and consistent, so I think it balances.
Right, and we still have visibility through looking at, the warrant report. It's not like it isn't visible to us. We can see those things, and, when you scan those and you see one of those bigger items, you think, was this budgeted? Does this make sense? And those are the things that kind of trigger, that's why we get to do what we get to do. And so, that's just another opportunity for us to ask those questions and say, well, what exactly was this again? And where was it budgeted? So, okay. Anything else with regard to purchasing policy? Oh, Joy?
I had one other question about the credit card. So my understanding is the village doesn't have a credit card right now, and that most of the time you guys are using your personal credit card. So I think it's great that we're going to do a credit card. I was just wondering how that is going to be recorded. Like, will we get a report like the warrant report, or how will we see those transactions? Will they be embedded into other reports, or?
So the transactions, as far as I know, some of the products that I've looked at would sit with a payee to the credit card with itemization underneath it.
Okay, and then the board would see that, that would be folded in
Yes.
somehow into like the finance report or something?
It would be on the warrant, so you'd see,
Right.
I'm
See it
not
on the
picking,
warrant.
you'd see bank XYZ with an itemization list of the various charges and the corresponding GL numbers. So similar to what you see now, just a different vendor name.
Okay. And the card, is the card actually like the name on, is it a card that everyone shares?
So our current, baby steps, our current intent is to have, one card that is stored locally here at Village Hall that would require, access through Drew or myself. Someone would have to come and get it and return it. But it wouldn't necessarily be an issuance to all department heads or everyone in that regard.
Okay, thanks.
And that's a good point. In large corporations, they use software that take the descriptions and it falls into the GL so that when you're looking at line items, it's captured accurately. In smaller organizations, oftentimes you just see a line item for credit card and it never really gets allocated, so you don't know what it was spent on. Bettina, you're saying that it will be allocated to the specific line items, the chargebacks?
So the software I've looked at through First Midwest Bank actually would upload, or we could use some sort of allocation. What I've seen is it's pretty detailed, even though we're just small in one town. So I think you definitely see a breakout.
Okay.
And it's not that those charges are so enormous that we couldn't even provide it manually. I mean, I can look at it right now and know on the warrant who would have used that card and what they would have been for, and to give you a little report that inserts wouldn't be a big deal.
Yeah, and this is more advice than you need, but implementing that system, just having done it, it is really painful and long and sometimes doesn't work.
Right. I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, any further comments about the credit card? Okay. On to the Streetscape improvement funding source. We're going to be talking about the Streetscape in the board meeting, but this is kind of looking at the projected costs based on what the plan looks like right now and what we might do in terms of options for funding those. So we have a list of funding alternatives. If you add them up, they're larger than the project. These are just monies that can be utilized for the project, and it's up to us to kind of look at these alternatives and say what makes sense for us. So before we look at the alternatives, at this point in time, the project looks to be, this is actually, okay, the project in total for
About
Streetscape
735.
is about 735, right?
Right.
So when we look at these funding alternatives, there's a few buckets that we can draw from. And you know, how do we prioritize when we look at these alternatives? How do we decide, you know, which is the best methodology? And, you know, first on the list is this one-time reimbursement from the Village of Glenview. That's something that was unexpected. And just a little recap of that would be
Sure.
in order.
So first, I'd just like to say, so the 735 number is sitting there, and 215 of that was budgeted. So we're down to about $520,000 worth of where are we taking that funding from? On September 1st, we received payment from the Village of Glenview, which was a reimbursement for the initial capital and redundancy costs that were contributed by the village to the 911 consolidation. So at the beginning, when consolidation was conceptualized and occurred, you know, each of the towns in the consolidated group contributed funds for capital and redundancy costs, and the Village of Glenview has since from the state received reimbursement, and they've distributed those funds out to the entities that made up the consolidation. So that's where that surprise, hey, we've got this money, came back to us from, and it's strictly just general fund revenue for us.
Okay, just to recap, the streetscape is at 735. The budgeted amount was
215.
215, so that leaves 520.
Right.
Okay, so the 520 is what we're looking at all these alternatives and saying, what's the best alternative? And certainly if we take that, you know, windfall of 191, we're a lot closer to, you know, making that selection.
I would benefit from further description of what these mean. I can kind of guess, or in some cases, maybe all I need to know is the title of it.
Sure.
But the significance of reducing the general fund transfer to capital fund, anyway, you understand, I need a little bit more color behind that.
Sure. So the original contribution to the general fund, so we transfer money from general fund to capital to make up the capital fund projects, so in the capital fund. And there were projects budgeted that either rolled over or costs have changed and pushed out to further years. So the funding for next year, the $250,000, isn't necessarily needed in the capital fund to make up the project list and the expenses that we have on the 10-year plan. That was part, I think you have it on your dais is there.
Right.
So that's where that extra 250 comes from. It was part of an originally planned transfer from general to capital that while we could do it to fund future things out, it isn't necessarily needed in the current budget cycle. So that's where that comes from. The contingency fund is a $200,000 fund, expense line that sits in the general fund, and we could potentially take 100,000, half of that, and spend it towards this project. Then use existing fund balance. That would just be, you know, use fund balance dollars that we currently have.
Which
Sorry.
Which I take it isn't limited to 525 in the fund balance right now. That's just how much
No.
we anticipate we would need for this
So
project.
the Moody's report had us around, sorry, I don't have it right in front of me, around 75.3% in the fund balance. After this draft of the audit, I think we're going to end up about 90% funded for FY21. We did that intentionally. Revenues came in higher than we thought, and we cut back because we weren't sure of COVID. So we're sitting on a fund balance that could be expended for something like this.
And then the normal fund balance goal is 50%.
50%. So that's where that kind of evolved. Now, reduce the replacement fund was not my suggestion, but it's certainly an option. So we make contributions from the general fund for each varying capital purchase in the replacement fund for squad cars, computers, whatever is slated, like for example, the tractor trucks from Public Works. So there's a calculation, and each department in the general fund makes a contribution. Those contributions were paused, if you will, during COVID, during the last budget year, and this number 180 is a partial number to get us back on track to contributing to the fund. So could we pause it again? You could. And then the last item, which is there because it's just more of a point of awareness. Years ago, the general fund made a loan to the water fund, and it has not been paid back. So theoretically, you could sweep money from water and bring it back to general.
Would that
Have
put
a net
water,
effect a net negative effect on water.
would it have a negative effect on water?
It would.
Okay. Can I just get a clarification on, I just want to make sure I understand the existing fund capital balance. You mentioned 90, how much is in that account now?
What's the cash balance value
Yeah.
of our current dollars?
For the fund,
Wow.
Capital fund,
the capital fund?
for the capital fund.
Oh, for the capital fund?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
Okay, I'll give you that.
well, just roughly. I mean,
That number.
Yeah.
It's a rolling number based on the expenses, obviously, but let me,
but you may not even have to look it up. Is the general idea that you want the capital fund to be the equivalent of 1 year's needs?
yes, or future planning. Like, for example, when we look at the Green Bay Road project that's coming forward, you know, do we want to, if we can, future plan to put some money towards that $1 million contribution that we have out in 2027 or 20.
Okay, so we want it to be fully funded for 1 year's worth of reoccurring needs plus whatever's been identified as special needs.
That's what we've been doing with that newly created fund, yes.
And we're saying that today, we expect that to be about 90% funded?
No.
For this year, I think we're only at $100,000 that's needed in that fund because there were some changes to the engineering plans that were made with regards to, Drew, help me out, was it
Yeah.
the bridge work?
I think the question that Member Rappin's asking, so the 90% mark is actually the village's general fund, the general purpose fund?
Oh,
Okay, I see.
correct. Yeah, sorry, I thought you meant, yes.
No, and that fund was purposely inflated to get us through as a safety cushion through the COVID. So we actually we didn't do certain things, like we purposely said, we're not going to fund the VERF, the Vehicle Replacement Fund.
Right.
We're not going to do these X number of capital projects. So to overinflate our number, because we didn't know where the sales tax, we didn't know what property tax, you just didn't know like where the revenue streams were going to land. So the village carried additional dollars more than its policy goals just to manage that time frame. And that's how actually we did better, even knowing how we were going to land, we did actually better because sales tax performed even higher than anticipated.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
So just to recap, the fund goal is 50% of expenditures, one for 1 year.
year's operating expenditures.
Right, so that's our goal, is that we would have sitting in that fund
At all times.
50% of what the next year's budget would be, so that, you know, we've got.
Okay,
we've
that's
got-
the benchmark.
Right, and we've got more than that. That's where the 90%
Got it. That's what I
comes
needed.
from.
The general
That's
fund.
great.
Yeah, sorry, I thought you were referring to the capital fund
And
itself.
so the village, for a few years, we had sales tax, and this is not uncommon, a lot of cities do this. If sales tax perform at a higher level than budgeted, that you get at the end of a fiscal year, and like, what do we do with this money? So the village threw it in this sinking capital fund, because we know we have capital needs. So the idea is that every year we did better, we started growing that fund, so, because we know we have, and you'll get to a bigger list of capital needs yet.
Yeah, the
So,
list just is,
But the
yeah.
idea that.
A little one.
Yeah, so that's a little history. And so
Got it.
the capital fund was established, what was it, 3 years ago? It wasn't
It
that long
sounds about
ago.
right, and,
Yeah,
and, you know,
yeah.
it'd be nice if the capital fund equaled the sum of all of these, but it does not. That's, yeah.
Man. Well, I guess to cut, did you have other questions
go
before
ahead,
we
go
cut to
ahead.
the chase? Right, because we're trying to get to a
Yes,
recommendation.
we're trying to evaluate our options. We've got a list of alternatives, and it's up to us to say, this is what we think makes sense. And that utilizing that one-time reimbursement from the Village of Glenview seems, you know, like low-hanging fruit. And so, you know, if you're okay with it, then, you know, let's recommend that be, you know, source number one. We're trying to add up to the difference between the project cost of $735 and what was budgeted, which is $215. That leaves $520 that we have to choose. $191 can come from this one-time reimbursement from the Village of Glenview, and that leaves what's next, right?
I guess my question is, how did we get to put a streetscape plan over and above storm sewer work? Because all the responses I'm getting are, I'm sorry, my basement's flooding, what are you doing? So the one response that I got in a text was, with an expenditure this large, why would this be put over, if we have this money and we're looking for a way to spend it, why are we not fixing the leaking roof instead of redecorating the living room? And I think that's what people are trying to understand, at least the people I'm talking to, is when we're discussing this, and again, this is my first finance committee meeting, but I'm just trying to figure out, how did we get to putting this as a priority over and above infrastructure work that is causing real damage to people's homes? I guess that's my question. I understand that may not be a cogent question for this, but this is a $1.6 million sitting out there. That's a lot of storm sewer work. So why this instead of that?
So I can, so on page 54, in the PDF of the packet is a list of considerations that the village considers when programming, whether it be road work,
Yeah.
sanitary sewer work. These are all considerations. The village does not score, like if you look at that capital plan, there's not a project score behind, say, the storm sewer project. We graded that as a 98%, project, or we don't rate projects. That has not been done here historically, and a lot of communities stay away from that because it hurts flexibility, and because there's times, for example, the village knew it was going to be replacing the asphalt and the curb work and doing repairs to the streetscape where the bricks, there's some bad infrastructure in the CBD that needed to get repaired or replaced.
Right.
So that started that conversation that the village looked at this, said, the village is going to be doing work here, we know it, we're going to try to do it at a time when it's least impactful to the businesses, which is at the end of the calendar year, when less people are dining outside, and try to not do it in the spring or summer, which would greatly impact their businesses. And then so the idea is the scope of the project grew and said, well, if we're going to do this, let's just really take care of what we can take care of and get done with it. And that's how they added work about, let's do some more streetscape work. And when we went back to the streetscape plan that was approved back in 2007, was what you saw in block 1, right? And that bluestone work and all those cobbled tumblers, that technically was the plan that the village was to follow. The reality was, we knew that plan was a bad idea. It was very expensive, and it did not live well, right? In less than 10 years, the bluestones popped.
Right.
The tree wells are too small. There's tripping hazards. We said this was not a good experience. We do not want to repeat this. And the village board said, we need a new plan. So we went back to the drawing board with Tesco. We shared with Public Works and Engineering what were best practices. And that's what came up with the scope of work that was in front of everybody, and that the ABR went through and looked at and said, we recommend the village board do this project. And that got to the village board back in June, I believe, or May. And the village board narrowed the scope of those improvements to eliminate certain amenities and thinned out the improvements to, I won't say bare bones, but there's still some amenities, right? You have these brick masonry benches, and you've got the festoon lighting. That's additional work than, meat and potatoes, if you will. But the idea was, let's do all this work at once to have the least amount of impact and take advantage of, we're going to be, doing this work now, let's just do it all and tear the Band-Aid off once. And also take advantage of these new best practices in streetscape work that make sense for what we've learned from living in a COVID world, where people want to have the ability to gather in outdoor public spaces. So let's create more of those spaces. Let's reduce the distance for pedestrians to cross streets.
Right.
And put these bump outs in there. If we can add trees, great. Let's sure not reduce parking. And that was a big, part of that also came about with the idea, if we changed made the street one directional, you can pick up a lot of parking spaces, but ultimately the character issues and quality of life were,
Safety.
it was judged that safety was a consideration, said, let's not do that. So this actual plan shows that you can actually pick up one stall on the north side of Scranton, one stall along East Center, kind of more or less in front of Twigs, and then you can paint a new stall in front of the library, so actually it will be a net 3.
Well, the other question I have is, this has ballooned in price considerably. So according to the Committee of the Whole meeting minutes from February, it was $375. When we met in May, it was between $285 and $420, and now it's $735. I don't know if anybody else noticed that, but is this is a substantial increase in the cost. And according to pretty much everything out there, and I can find the article, we're looking at material cost increase in the 8 to 10% range. And I just think it begs the question, is now the best time to be buying into this right now? that is a substantial increase. I mean, it just shocked me when I saw that number. We've grown, it doubled the cost.
And I think, Jeff, can you talk about that? Because we had that conversation internally too about what do we recommend and what, you know, because
I mean,
when
what's
is the
the
right time to do
urgency
this?
of now?
Yeah.
If we put this off until, everything I'm reading is suggesting that these prices are going to come down. So I'm wondering, is there something magical about, and I'm not being facetious, I'm really serious. What is it about right now that there's such immediacy that it needs to be done when this has gone to 7:35?
Well, no, you go ahead first, please.
Well, I guess I didn't know if Jeff was going to say
Yeah,
something there,
if that's all right.
yeah, let him
Okay.
go ahead and. Yeah.
Okay.
So the immediacy is basically that the street is in desperate need of repairs. Those bricks keep falling off. Public Works has been essentially pasting those on every winter for several years, and the pavement's about worn out. So this whole process started with the thought that we need to repave the street very soon. And what else should we do while we're repaving the street? We have it torn up, you know, some like the bump outs make sense because why put down new asphalt and come back 2 years from now and rip that all back out and, you know, and make the bump out. So that's kind of where we started with the immediacy of this. And also we had some issues last spring with the street lights along Scranton. The original design had a loop system. So if power failed in one direction, we would get power from the other. And that one leg has been broken for several years. And then we had the last remaining leg broke this spring, and it took about a month to repair because the conduit was full of ice. And it was, they see 3 different holes. I think Public Works had to dig out there to get that repaired. So that system also has failed. So those, you can see it looks like kind of a patchwork. They kind of just fix the concrete in anticipation of a project this fall to fix it nicer and make it look new again. So those factors pushed us into wanting to do this fall. That and we don't. I mean, I'm concerned that we.
Jeff, I'm sorry, this is Drew. Let me interrupt you again. The other thing is we reached out to the property owners and the tenants and said, hey, this is what's being kicked around. If you have other thoughts or concerns, and then we got, yeah, fix this stormwater problem here and, you know, along East Center. And hey, you know, we've noticed that these trees and these areas of green grass are getting trampled. It's a mud bath every year. Can we improve this? So we also got feedback from the merchants saying, you need to do some improvements here in these areas and make these more practical and more greater utility. Sorry, Jeff, please continue.
No, that's a good point. I wasn't going to mention that, but yeah, along East Center with the drainage issue, that wouldn't normally have been considered with, you know, repaving that block of Scranton, but it fits nicely into this project as proposed. And the other thing is, you know, in the spring, hopefully COVID is more gone and these businesses are opening up for full capacity and people are more comfortable going out. I'm very concerned about, you know, ripping up the street right when that happens next year.
Is there any way that we can do a bridge between these numbers? I mean, maybe a little bit is change in scope, maybe a little bit is price increase, maybe a little bit of it is, you know, we had what used to be a good estimate and now it's not. I mean, you don't, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but if we can just kind of like big picture bridge it a little bit from that original number to the final number, it would just, I think it would go a long way in terms of, you know, what people, you know, I think it'll go a long way. So I am kind of putting you on the spot, Jeff, or Drew, or whoever, but.
I think there is an important point here, Kate. There is an important point that is, you're absolutely right. Number one is stormwaters, okay? We're not deviating from that. This is actually what we are working on pretty much every day to go and resolve, to find the capital and so on. So don't get me wrong, don't get us wrong. This is what is on our mind.
Right, I'm
Number
just saying
two.
that, like, the stormwater project on my street didn't cost $17 million, and it was $735,000. So I'm talking about spot work,
So
not
number two,
massive.
the second concern I have is for our business community and for COVID not going away. And the point is, not only from Drew and Jeff's standpoint, there are stuff that have failed in our community, such as we don't only put festoon lights, but we also repair what was not working there. Okay, let's get that very clear. We fix the sidewalks, but what we also do from a community standpoint is extend and expand on what has been successful for people to be outside and eat outside to support our business community. It's not like we're having fun. This is very much like, no, we need to support the business community outside. And that is not concurrent and before stormwater. This is in addition to stormwater. We need to care about that.
I do. I just think that unless you've done a cost-benefit analysis, I'm not sure how $128,000 worth of festoon lighting is going to have an exponentially.
I think it does, because when it's
There are
actually,
lights there already.
no, when it's actually dark outside, if you look at the lights we have outside, they don't cover for the correct illumination of the street. What we have people dining outside, and we need the lights out there. And I think that putting those lights, even though it looks pretty and so on, and it might be superfluous, I think it is important to actually help the people that will put lights outside to sustain their restaurants in the coming months. And I think that is the idea.
Well, I did an analysis of the number of hours that they'd actually be used and necessary and on, and it's not a lot, so.
Well, that, you could say that about all streetlights. I mean,
No, I'm talking about a lot, and I think we'll cover it later. I mean, there are a lot of issues with this, but that's just I just fundamentally disagree with that as something necessary. The rest, what Jeff describes, absolutely. The repaving, the electrical work, I can see that as real infrastructure.
right, so can we do a little quick bridge after we
But not
answer Joyce's
lights.
question?
Yeah, I guess maybe my comment is just that, some of these things are like intangible as to how people view our village and when they come in, and this, to work on the streetscape and make it look nicer. It's an entrance into our town. It reflects on our town. It encourages people to come here. It encourages them to spend money. It encourages them to move here. So I feel like there's a lot of intangibles, and I know you're shaking your head, Kate,
Yeah,
but
I
I
just
also
don't
feel
agree.
like too, when you look at these projects, like there's all these projects going on concurrently, right? We have to kind of manage, if we wait and wait and wait to do any kind of beautification project, it never gets done. So I think the fact that it came forward to us in this instance, right, where we're already doing paving and we have an opportunity, I agree that the cost ballooned, right? So in our next meeting, in the village board meeting, we're gonna look at, is that cost appropriate, is it not? I'm sure we're gonna have a lively discussion there on what, but we can still make adjustments to what we're spending there. But to kick this down the curb again when we have the opportunity, because we're redoing the street, and we know that our business, the folks with businesses would love it. I think the residents would love it. I feel like there is definitely reason to do it. Maybe we just relook at the cost or look at the bridge so that we can have say, okay, here's a realistic number. Here's what we can realistically do right now. I would be disappointed if we just scrapped the whole project. I do think it would be.
I don't think we should scrap the whole project. I just think we need to be mindful of what we can't do if we do all of it.
Barbara, can I just ask from a process standpoint, is this a discussion for now, or is this a discussion for our trustee meeting?
The finance committee is addressing what are the sources of funds. We have choices of where these monies can come from, and that dollar amount started out here, grew to there.
Mm-hmm.
There will be some discussion, there will be, perhaps some tweaks. So what we're doing is we're identifying how we're going to fund what that final number is.
Assuming we funded the entire thing. That's our job
Exactly.
right now.
I mean,
Okay.
right, so that's the purpose of this discussion, and I do welcome your comments, Kate, because I do think we need to be mindful of what it is that we're doing. It's, nothing that we're doing is in a vacuum, and things do change over time, and so I'm very interested in, once again, how did we start at one spot and get at a very different spot, because that will help to inform the discussion that we also have at the board level in a very short amount of time. So,
Well, can I ask
So-
a question then, Barbara, about the funding alternatives, since I'm in the minority here, and it seems like this is something people are in favor of. How do you prioritize which of these would be better to take from?
well, that is why we asked Bettina to kind of just describe to us what it is that we're doing in each of these. So,
Are these listed in any particular order, Bettina, in terms of preference for
No.
use?
They're not, they're totally random.
Random?
right.
Well, for example, the vehicle replacement contribution, that was on the agenda tonight. So do we really want to take from that, for example?
So I can speak briefly to the replacement fund itself. It's pretty strong. It's sitting over $1 million and we don't have huge expenditures slated from it other than squad car purchases. Now, that being said, could there be a need that arises? Sure. But it's sitting there pretty strong as a big fund.
But Tina, just to be clear though, there was a recommendation included in this memorandum to utilize.
There was.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that still holds true, that, you know, the money from the Glenview capital grant dollars of 191, the 250K portion of the general fund transfer, and then up to 84 from the contingency budget.
I hadn't seen that, but that was exactly what I would have recommended. The other ones all would create a burden. We know that, you know, the existing fund balance of 525 is, you know, it's where we need it to be. I would suggest, I agree with that, with the recommendation, the top three would be the right place to pull. And again, Kate, this is hypothetical, assuming the trustees approve the spend later today. So I don't know, Susan, if you have a thought on that.
Yeah, the description that Bettina just offered was very helpful. And in this regard, I would, barring any kind of description of something to the contrary, I would defer to the folks who deal with this budget day in and day out. And it's if we decide to spend the money, I trust that they will know the better of the places to pull it from.
So this list was put together to give us informed discussion starters for, you know, well, what are our options? These are options that we can discuss. But then again, they've also made recommendations. So the purpose of this is for us to say, you know, yes, we agree with those recommendations. These other sources are options, but this is what we would like to do. And it sounds like, based on the discussion that we've had, we are interested in following staff recommendations. And this list is not meant to say that this is just money that's sitting there that we're never going to use, and it's wasteful and it's just sitting there. That was not the purpose of this list. The purpose of the list was to show us, you know, what are our options, right? Because you are intimately involved in what the fund balances are. So if we want to follow staff recommendations, and it sounds like that's what we want to do we want to make a motion then that we recommend those three funding sources?
Should the board approve it? Yeah.
If the board, yeah, and the level of the board-approved project is yet to be discussed.
I'd like to make a recommendation that we follow the recommendation that staff has made.
And do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, thank you. Next is an audit request for proposal.
Basically, that's just an informational item that I'll just speak to very briefly. So we've had Sikich as an auditor firm for the village for a number of years, preceding me for quite a bit. And that contract's been extended a few times, and it's just time to go out and do an RFP for auditing services. I've reached out to a group of other communities, and we have a couple of others that would like to join in just to see if we can get reduced cost if people respond to our RFP. So that's in process, and that's pretty much where we're at.
Okay, so you're not looking for any direction from the board, it was informational?
Just informational, right?
Got it. Any questions?
No.
Thank you. Okay, so on to the business items. Capital projects, well, we did the funding sources. Actually, we kind of combined those two items. Have we fully discussed that order of business for the capital projects and the funding? I think we have. I think we're on to the fee waiver item.
I'd like to discuss more fully this as opposed to the funding for
Okay.
the streetscape.
Wow.
So I'd say the funding sources we've exhausted, but the capital projects plan,
Yes,
we've not.
right. Okay, so Bettina, did you, or Jeff, do we want to have Jeff kind of walk us through this, or you know, what would you recommend?
Well, what I'd like to do is do a quick presentation.
Oh, did you get that
But I think I'm afraid I may have messed up our Zoom. Let me double check that.
Nope, there they are.
All right. So I will do my best to cover everything. So, but if I miss, please let me know. Specifically talking about the 10-year capital plan. But what we wanted to do is, because there are so many new members, is give a kind of a very broad overview of how the village is taking on and tackling its vast capital assets. It's certainly evolved over time, and I would say it's gotten more sophisticated for the board members that have been here. Each year we get better and better at this, as hopefully we should. And but what I want to do is talk about our existing asset management system. I'll talk about some new infrastructure needs that we've been walking around all night tonight, talking about stormwater, and then talk about some funding alternatives, which will become aware of why we need to have that conversation, and then possible next steps. So right now, and Jeff, you can jump in and out of the conversation. Hopefully you're seeing this, Jeff?
Yes.
Great. So right now, the village has a very large network of transportation system, which includes all pathways, roadways, bridges. We have sanitary sewer network, storm sewer, water. A lot of these look very similar because, not surprisingly, these fall in the same right-of-ways, right? They kind of travel the same pathways.
I'm sorry, Drew. I'm just looking at your file structure, not the presentation itself.
Sure.
Right. You have to share this screen now. When you put it into slideshow mode, I think it took it out of that screen.
There we go.
You're seeing this now?
Yes.
Okay, this is what I was seeing earlier. That's surprising me. So if it doesn't change or something, let me know. I'll try again. So thanks. Over the years, the village has been increasing its funding levels in its existing infrastructure, and again, these broad categories. I would say that the village has been taking, organizationally, we have been making adjustments in how we do business, whether it be outsourcing or leaning down how we do work over the years to increase the amount of dollars that were available to go into capital and take it out of operations. And that's been done in big picture over the last 12 years. The village has gone from 55 regular full-time employees to 33. And we've made other changes in how we do business, whether it be, how we plow our streets in the winter, to even within the finance department, how we do business there, adjusting our procedures to lighten the load operationally, and always constantly trying to do that, and whether joint procurements with other communities or other entities, always trying to find ways to lean out. And again, because we have such large capital needs, and as an example, right now, the village historically, and this is looking back for the last 4 to 5 years, has been investing close to $750,000 in its roadway system. Obviously, asphalt, the prices of asphalt keep going up and up and up, and that number goes, it gets, the investment goes not as far, just the bottom line. But right now, we're in the process of, Jeff, why don't you talk about the rating system that we're getting for our roadway system and how we can gauge in the future, I guess, investment in the system.
Yeah, we got a grant of services through CMAP where we had a company, IMS, come and use their laser truck to look at all of our pavement and analyze it and put a rating on every basically segment that we maintain. We're in the progress of getting their final report, which I believe they're going to present to the board at some point, which will essentially say you're investing X, per year in your streets right now. And if you want to improve your rating by, this many points, then you should invest this much more. Or if you don't invest, any more, you keep it at where it's at. This is where we expect your street network to be in 5 to 10 years rating wise. So that will give us a good idea if they feel that our annual investment will sustain our streets in the condition they are now. And then we can make the decision, do we want to invest more to improve, or maybe you need to invest more just to keep them as they are now, or less, and see what will happen to the streets in the future.
Yeah, so, in that, you can compare ourselves to other communities and say, how do we compare to Milwaukee, or in terms of like, and hopefully we're always fare better than Milwaukee if you've driven on those roads. But, and then, so our sanitary system, the village has done okay in keeping up with that infrastructure. Storm is one you can see there's a big gap there, and that's something that, the village will get more into. And water is another system that is, Jeff, how would you describe it?
We're behind. I mean, the average age of our water pipe is more than you would like it to be. If you, assume you're going to replace every pipe every 75 years, our average age is probably over 50 by lineal foot of pipe. So it is something that will cost more in the future as we continue to have more and more breaks.
And you ask yourself, when can we impact this number? And interestingly enough, you can impact it when you make land use decisions. So for example, Tangley Oaks, Jeff, why don't you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and the exact number escapes me, but I think there's about 200 homes in Tangley Oaks, but it's about, I think, between 15 and 20% of our lineal feet of pipe that we have buried for water, sanitary, and storm sewer. So those big lots, very large amounts of frontage per property, and the pipe costs the same per foot if you're serving the downtown and the east side with 50, 60 foot wide lots as it does in Tangley Oaks, where they're sometimes 200 to 300 feet.
So the investment grows based off land use decisions and how dense the developments are, et cetera, et cetera.
He said it's more, it's the same,
It's
more
It's
with
much
the
more
bigger
because
in
the
Tangley Oaks, because it's
the
double the
distance
footage.
between homes, and it's a large loop road, and like I said, most of this infrastructure lies in the right of way, so the distances grow.
But Tangley Oaks is only 40 years as a development.
Yes.
A little younger.
Howsoever. And Jeff, is it soils? What is it?
We've had water main issues in Tangley Oaks. We don't know. I don't think the pipe that they used, there might have been some bad batches of pipe, but soil acidity does attack ductile iron pipe, and we've had some breaks where we've looked at the pipe and noticed it's in pretty bad shape along Armour. We actually are working on a project to replace the water main at Ascot Court, because we've had, I think, 3 breaks in the past 6 or 7 years on that little stretch of Ascot Court. So we're watching that, but that's a huge concern, because if the 40-year-old pipe starts failing and we have a bunch of 80-year-old pipe still we haven't replaced, then we're going to have an issue. So we're hoping that it was confined to a few maybe bad loads of pipe that have been deteriorating faster than the others, because the breaks have seemed to be, kind of in the same spots. But yeah, if Tangley Oaks starts having major water main issues, then it'll be very hard to keep up with our replacement throughout the village.
And Jeff, why don't you quickly just run through each asset category in terms of what's an expected shelf life, a realistic shelf life?
Yeah, when you talk about, our asphalt streets, 12, 15 years before we're resurfacing. Bridges should be 50 years. Doesn't seem like we've gotten 50 years out of a lot of them lately. Asphalt paths, maybe 15 to 20 years, a little more. When you get into sanitary sewer or storm sewer, 75 years is not, some people will say 50 years, but we have a lot of 100-year-old pipe still serving us in the village. So kind of think of it as maybe about a 75-year return. Water main is pretty similar, as long as we don't have issues like we've had on Tangley Oaks. But that would be, a lot of these systems, they need regular maintenance in addition to, wholesale replacement every 75 years or so. So that the costs are more than just replacement every 75 years. There's annual maintenance, storm sewer, the basins and the manholes and the sanitary sewer manholes, they usually need attention probably every 30 to 40 years. Some of the work that we've done, especially with our storm basins, it's kind of more of the Band-Aid variety where we go and we patch it up, but it's not going to last 40 more years. It's going to last probably 15 more years. We'll be back again, patching it again.
So, thank you, Jeff. So,
Can I ask a question?
Please.
When you say funding sources over in the right-hand column, that's where the source is ultimately the taxpayer, right?
Yeah.
But the general fund is where we put the money pending spending it.
Well, except the
example.
grants or the motor fuel tax that,
But is that, did you call it motor fuel tax? That's
FT dollars,
MFT?
yeah.
Okay, I see. So general fund money comes from taxes and,
Variety of sources, yes. The biggest variety, fees,
okay.
taxes, property taxes, sales taxes,
and fees.
shared fees from the state, dollars we get from the state.
And I take it we have a separate water fund here.
We have a separate enterprise fund, the water fund, which stands alone, should stand alone, and that you set water rates annually to help support the replacement of capital. But over time, the village has raised rates over the years, but there's been periods of time when it hasn't been raised rates for a long time, and that's not terribly uncommon. It's not ideal, because then you have to do catch-ups and, and it's, and like most things here, like Jeff said, there's towns that, think about our infrastructure, we're a rather old community, right? So our infrastructure in a lot of areas is aged in place, some of it well, some of it not so well. Compare us to a new community, like say a Naperville or some other community with a lot of new growth, and Vernon Hills, rolling out a lot of newer streets and so forth. Their infrastructure is a lot newer than ours, and so, if they're doing the right things, they're setting aside dollars to repay for this, pay for replacement of these. But most towns are not setting the rates to the true number to replace, just like they're not setting the true number for ambulance services or whatever, because it's so costly, right? There's a lot of subsidization that goes on, or there's a lot of trade-offs that are made, say, because we're gonna do X before we do Y, and we'll push Z off to the future. And that's the way it works.
And I take it the annual investment level is what each year in the budget we say we're going to take toward this particular line item.
And that has been, yes, and that is something, again, that the village has tried to make a conscious effort, is to try to invest at a certain level by activity, and has gotten more sophisticated over the years trying to identify that number. And again, like over the time, the village's number for investment in its transportation system used to be about $500,000. Well, because asphalt has gone up in price, petroleum-based products, it's like, now you got to invest more, and it goes a lot shorter. And I guess even another approach, even how you do this tactically, Jeff has been more aggressive than his predecessor, not good or bad, but doing more concrete work, ADA work, other minor storm sewer work along the way, so that we hate to resurface a road, then have to come around the next week and say, oops, we forgot to do something, and, we don't want to do that. We want to clean as we go. So, and Jeff's been really good about that.
You know what, one thing that would be very good on that diagram, and I understand that. So Jeff talked about the truck with the laser program to know how much road would be. So it would be very interesting to have a percentage next to that 725 that is we are funding at 40% or 95% to where we should be funding, similarly to pensions, basically. And I know that for sanitary, Jeff cannot go in the ground and look at the water mains or the sanitary pipe. But it would be good to have an idea.
Some other metric.
To work on that idea, to say, okay, we don't know that today, but what is it gonna take to know tomorrow?
Isn't that kind of what the ideal,
Well, but the idea is
relation
more like a
is?
ballpark, right? This is not the true number.
Well, Jeff, and talk about that if you would, please.
But the true, I'm sorry, what, the true number of,
I guess two things. One is, so the road system, the grading that you're going to be given is relative to other roadway systems, right? So the idea that the village's roadways are as they are today, and say we got a number, say that's a number is associated with a 62 rating or something like
Yes.
that. As an example, well, again, Milwaukee may be at a 42. Well, Lake Bluff has its community expects its road to be at least a 60. Kind of over time, what's the expectation of residents to travel a road? How much do they want to bounce around, right? When they ride their bike, do they want to have vibrate down the street, or, you know, so it's a expectation level on how well the village maintains its roadways.
And that report's gonna recommend that we do more preventative maintenance mid-cycle and early in the life of asphalt to extend its life. Towards the end, we've been kind of chasing bad streets for the past, at least as long as I've been here, where we haven't put that investment, you know, in a street that's 2 years old to try to make it last 20 years instead of 15. And I think that's going to be a big part of that report is recommendations on some more early intervention in the streets to make them last longer.
And just give them an idea what that means, Jeff.
There's certain chemicals, rejuvenators. You know, we did a little bit of crack sealing a couple of years ago. We skipped it last year due to COVID, but that should be happening again this year. But the crack sealing, and then there's all kinds of products that tend to almost like asphalt dries out and cracks, and it's supposed to stop that from happening. You apply them a year to 2 years after the asphalt is new. It's not exactly seal coating, but in your mind you could think of it kind of in a similar way. It's a little more high tech than that, and it's supposed to extend the life of asphalt. And we just traditionally haven't done that because we've had enough streets that we felt needed, you know, intervention now that's eaten up our budget for street work.
And Jeff, the idea of question about having some sort of metric to objectively measure the village's or rate the village's sand sewers or storm sewers or water systems. Is there such a similar application or approach in the public works universe?
Yeah, well, we do televise our sand sewers mostly. So we spend quite a bit looking at and trying to prioritize which ones need lining more than others. There are manhole inspection machines that you basically put over the manhole, and it scans the manhole and will rate it. We haven't found the need. That's rather expensive, I think. I'd rather spend more money actually doing work, because usually we can walk down the street and look at the cracks next to the manhole and figure out which manholes need work. So until we get down to the last few that we need, we don't really need to hire the machine to do that. But we do televise sanitary. I'd like to televise storm a little more, but we generally put those dollars towards sanitary.
The idea I was trying to get to is, instead of saying, well, ballpark 500,000 and we only spent 285,000 and we should feel bad about it, is a different idea that is, no, really, we need $400,000 for storm. I mean, this is completely, I'm not saying this is right, but
You're just making,
but the point is having a more objective metric to know where we are, so that this is no longer a financial dashboard that is, maybe we should do that, but this is a more of a quality dashboard that is, we really know where we stand, and maybe we stand better than what that chart does, or we may be much worse than where we think we are. And I think in order to improve, we need to have a right metric. We need to have a right. We need to have a right target to be able to improve our aim. You know, that is my point.
Sure.
I've got a question. For these four, I think we've talked a lot about storm, and in storm, I think I've heard a number of $40 million to really get to what we need. So this shows what current annual investment level would be. Well, 285,000. Sure, it's under. What this doesn't capture is, well, you need $40 million to make it right.
That's the next slide.
I know it's the next, but what I wanted to know is these other categories, do we have a number to get it right as well? Are there major capital needs, or are those just annual investments?
The streets, we'll get that from our study. Bridges, we're actually a little bit, we'll be ahead once we do the Green Bay Road Bridge. When it comes to sanitary sewer, I don't think that number really exists right now. We are analyzing different areas of the village and then repairing things as needed. One of the challenges is, yes, it's an 80-year-old clay pipe in the ground, but it looks fine. Not really in a position to preemptively line that pipe just because we think it might only have 10 years left. So we're trying to, when you televise them, it will show you all the cracks and all the parts that are maybe about to fail. And our goal is to get those lined before they fail, because then we don't have to dig it up. So that seems to have worked. Some of the manholes we'd like to do a little more work on, and storm. Like I said, we just don't replace things generally. And we'll get to that more when we get to the $40 million. But water main, our number of leaks has been fairly consistent, but that's a little more, age is a little more predictive of failure in water than it is in sanitary and storm. So I feel like our water breaks are going to start going up as we don't lower the average age of our pipe.
Okay, but it sounds like the only item on here is storm that really will require a major capital investment.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, though? Is the investment meaning the expenditure? Or are we setting it aside? Because like I said, the project in front of my house was 735, so, and that's one question. And then the second one is why the shortfall? The others are so much closer to each other. So that's the most significant shortfall and the most significant need by far. So what is like, the water's only 100,000 apart. Why is there such a significant difference there?
I think the current annual investment level column is kind of a short window looking backwards right now.
Okay.
And the project in front of your house, I think that 700 also included the West Sheridan storm sewer in the East Terrace neighborhood.
Okay.
So it was one big project we've done in the last 5 years. I think, and Drew, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've kind of held off on some other storm things while we're trying to get the viaduct problem solved.
Yeah, that's right, and we'll get into that, and that's a great lead-in, because
Right.
one of the critical, and thank you for this tee up, but one of the big answers is dedicated revenues.
So, okay, that's what I was wondering, because it seems to me that piecemeal repair, what was done on my street ameliorated the problem entirely. So that begs the question, why? I understand the viaduct, that is a separate animal altogether. That, to me, shouldn't even be part of the conversation, because it has so many moving parts with the railroad and IDOT, et cetera.
Yeah.
But just what the streets we control that are not a state highway,
Yeah.
like my street, West Shore, and there's still severe flooding on the East Terrace. So I'm just, we're looking at these in a piecemeal year after year, year over year, or are we looking to accumulate, like Steve,
Yeah.
and 40 million, is it?
Again, thank you. This, you were leading right into this, so thank you very much.
Yeah,
So I'm usually not this good of a storyteller, so.
gotta eat the elephant, I think.
So hopefully the slide follows here. Did it follow, Jeff?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna turn it over to Jeff, but these areas that are circled, it's blurry by design.
Oh, okay, good. I was wondering.
So,
I'm like,
but we'll start off with, this is project one, and let me step back for 1 second. No, I don't want to do that. Jeff, why don't you go ahead and start?
Yeah, can you just go back one slide just for a second?
I'm afraid. Did it go? Okay.
Okay, so the areas you see circled in red were areas that we specifically analyzed in our report from a couple of years ago. The intent is to continue to analyze the rest of the village, but these were the areas where we thought we had the biggest issues. They were the easiest clumped together to do an analysis of, and we had, in some cases, property owners who were interested in doing a project, so we included that analysis in it, but this is not intended to be, all of the problems in Lake Bluff. This is just what we've studied so far. We had a cap on cost for that study, and this was the first ones that we looked at. And then you can go ahead, Drew. And this is, as you just spoke of, the East Terrace, about $2.6 million to replace all these pipes. And one issue we have here is we can't do this until the viaduct is solved, because we can't dump all this extra water into the viaduct right now. It's all going to end up in the same pipe. So we could put all these pipes in, but we'd have to essentially choke the end of it off to leave it go into the existing 24-inch pipe to the viaduct. So this is probably the neighborhood where we've had the biggest issues with people's homes getting wet and their yards having, sustained wet areas. But until we can get further along with the viaduct, it's hard to do this, because we have no place to put this water other than in the viaduct if we do these improvements. But this project at 2.6 million, actually the Green Bay Road portion you see up there would get done with the Green Bay Road project. But again, it would be choked off at the end, because it's just going to go into the existing pipe on West Center.
And all these projects generally involve upsizing the stormwater pipes that are there.
Yeah, I mean, this study basically looked at, this is our existing pipes, and then as these pipes get replaced, in some cases it would be in one big project. This might make more sense to be a bigger project. Some of the other areas, like when we get to the West Terrace, we wouldn't try to rip up the entire subdivision at once to replace all the pipes, but as pipes rot out and need to be replaced, now we know what size pipe is supposed to go there. So even piecemeal, we can put back the appropriate pipe.
So Jeff, this is because of the Continental Divide, right? We can only move the water east, right?
From Green.
Yes, we can't send it to the Skokie. Hind Park would be very upset, and that would cause a big problem. But even just gravity says it's hard to move, this water west to the Skokie, other than the stuff right at the tip on Green Bay Road. Even, it's just hard to fight slope.
Right, gravity.
What's the difference between the red and the blue, Jeff? I can kind of see that legend, but not really
Yeah.
clearly.
So the red is what we have modeled as flooding during a 100-year storm right now.
Okay.
And if these improvements are put in, it would go down to where the blue is.
Okay.
It'd be helpful if we had the 10-year storm on there, since our goal is
Yeah.
not to dry the street in the 100-year storm.
Okay.
But this does take water away from people's homes. It's more than it probably appears so on this map.
Okay.
And Jeff, the 100-year storm event, you're using which standard?
We're using the new one.
This is still, I believe, the old one in this drawing,
Okay.
because this was done before they changed it.
Yeah.
What is that, Jeff? What's the difference between the old one and the new one in terms of rate of, per hour?
It's not per hour. I'm not familiar. It's about 30% more rain per a 24-hour storm. It went up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And that, the delta between the old and new 100-year event, Jeff, in terms of cost?
Well, we know the viaduct, it changed a 48-inch pipe into a 60, which is, I think, the next exhibit we have on here, because we did look at that one after this was initially published for a funding application we did. So yeah, this says 48 going from the viaduct north and then east north for a while. But when we looked at the new storms, it turned into a 60. That is significant. In some of these smaller areas, it's not as, because going from a 15-inch to an 18-inch pipe isn't as substantial. But I think it added $2 million to this one we're looking at right now, which is the viaduct project. And then you can kind of see we have on here a 30-inch pipe going over into the East Terrace neighborhood to pick up what would be the improvements we just looked at on the last slide. So this is all connected.
Yeah, that same North Avenue trunk system, Trustee Briand, was, you said, because it's complex and there's a lot of, unfortunately, those are all the people we needed to go to the dance with to get this deal, because all these straws feed into that trunk.
Right. I remember this from the orientation.
Yes.
And this is the deep tunnel project that's akin to what Winnetka started to do. But they had the, if you can say it this way, the good fortune to have their flooding on the west side of Green Bay Road, so they just moved it to the lagoons. But this is, Jeff, didn't you say then that this is like a 5-year project to get this from start to finish along North Avenue to the lake?
If you had to hurry, you could probably do it in 3 or 4, but it probably is. I mean, the odds that we're going to have $17 million, drop in our lap to spend all in 1 year is pretty slim.
Right.
I mean, just as a construction project, it's at least 2 years, and then the planning is a year or 2 before that. So I think 5 years is a good estimate.
And I see it goes from 48 to 60. What's the?
Yeah. So I guess we re-looked at this for a funding application a few months ago. It's actually all those 48s turned into a 60 with the new storm. And then the 60s through the ravine in Lily and Dell turned into a 72.
Wow.
So
Jeez.
it's a big pipe. Yeah.
Right, and then with the Lily and Dell work, that would undo all the work that's been done there, and that would dump out through there, so they'd have to go back into Lily and Dell.
Yeah, and they haven't finished that work yet, and that work will be nice when it's done. Cost-wise, it's a relatively small number compared to this project.
Jeff, when you mentioned the funding sources, Jeff, what are we currently looking at for the funding sources for, are we looking at the state?
You want to jump ahead?
I'll tee it up for you.
We can continue the horror story. There's more to come.
Oh, good.
No. Here we go.
And I might go a little more quickly through these. I don't want to run into
Yeah.
the board meeting here. But these are, again, like I said before, we wouldn't do all this at once. You know, this neighborhood, this would be something that would happen street by street as pipes need to be replaced or as we have issues. These, you know, this all connects into that big trunk once it's there. This shows it as a standalone through the trunk, but I think we would do the other way around and do the trunk first. And then the next one. Yeah, so here you can see a much more, you know, dramatic loss of ponding on the streets from the red to the blue. But again, this is just another area where we show a lot of water in the street. And this might not be the highest of priorities because this water generally doesn't go into homes. But as these pipes rot away, we should replace them with the appropriate size pipe.
And Jeff, while you're here and talking about this, you talk about the water in the streets. There's been a standard that the village has used when trying to cure some stormwater projects when it made sense. For like example, the work that was done in the East Terrace not too long ago. Could you, you said it once, but I don't know that people understood that. Would you please clarify?
Yeah, and that is a 10-year storm. So that anytime we have up to a 10-year storm, we want to have the pipe size so that it will keep water off the streets up to that 10-year storm.
And also out of homes at
And out of homes in a 100-year storm.
100-year event.
Yes.
So first priority is out of homes, second priority is out of streets.
For those who were around, we used to have something called the Skittles map that showed all those hot spots, bright colors, different colors. And I think, I mean, Jeff, in terms of what's left on that map.
We got most of the homes. So that was the project Kate's referenced in front of her house. I mean, there's a home there that flooded, and the one on West Sheridan Place also flooded. So that's where we prioritize that first clump of money to try to get those problems solved. And now there's a couple left, but we're working on those as well.
Yep.
Yeah, there's still issues. So are you saying, I'm sorry, going back, did you say some of these can, with the exception of the East Terrace, talking about piecemeal, there are some that could be done prior to the East Terrace and the Deep Tunnel project being done, right?
Here's a good example.
Like this one here that we're looking at is a very small one. The people who own property there all said they would like this to be done. This is a very low cost for just this project, but for the pipes, but we have to look at that ravine, and I've had several property owners along that ravine concerned about erosion. So this would take a bit of a planning effort to make sure we study that ravine and the impact of, you know, enlarging this pipe to the ravine would have. But there's a house that is flooded in this area as well.
And Jeff, how do we make the decisions on which ones we're going forward with? Does it depend on how many houses it affects, or is it just the level of flooding or the frequency of flooding? Do we have any kind of system for that?
Yeah. Well, we started with, you know, we took a survey of the community of who floods, and we tried to figure out why they flood. Some people flood because their sewer backs up. Some people flood because there's some grading issue around their home. So we tried to find all the ones that we felt like it was the substandard storm sewer serving that street was contributing to the flooding, and try to fix. That was kind of the low-hanging fruit because those stood out. Beyond that, we look for major street issues like this one here. We're looking at the West Terrace. You see a lot of flooding on that map. I don't get a lot of complaints from the West Terrace. Our survey of the community didn't show a whole lot compared to other neighborhoods. So this one we studied, you know, it'd be $7 million basically to rebuild the whole storm system in this neighborhood, but I don't think we would recommend, you know, a wholesale, you know, bond $7 million to fix these issues because they just haven't caused significant problems for these residents that we are aware of so far. And then like this one we put in here because you see the end of the arrows down into the ravine. I know that it's a corrugated metal pipe. It's about the end of its useful life. It's going to fail probably in the next 10 years. So I wanted to know, you know, what size pipe should it be to put a new pipe down that ravine and going back into this neighborhood. So this is another neighborhood where, you know, I don't get a whole lot of complaints in this area, but I know that the clock is ticking on that pipe. So we wanted to have this studied so we would know what should be here.
So, revenue sources to pay for this, you know, how can this get done? The Finance Committee has talked about for a year the idea of having a stormwater utility fund to close this gap, to capture revenues to support these needs, these new needs. And when you're designing revenue sources, all these things circling around this central bubble here are goals, right? You want it to be convenient, certain, equitable, and efficient and neutral, all those things, but usually they're not. It's not 100%, you know, it's difficult to tie that. That's one of the reasons why the Finance Committee liked the utility fees, because it was directly connected. The idea was to design a fee that was based off impervious surface on your lot, and so that there was a direct linkage between what persons were owed in terms of what they were contributing to the problem. And so, good news with that makes sense, that seems fair. In practice, it has pushbacks from institutional users like churches or, you know, shopping centers that have large parking lots, that have lots, you know, impervious surface, but guess what? They're still subject to these fees and this fee schedule. So this is, or schools, you know, the idea of, hey, we don't have this, how does this further education? Well, you're still contributing to this larger community issue, and it's not unheard of. I mean, Winnetka has done it with with the New Trier District. It's happened. So I mean, there's ways to make these things happen. They're very common. And this is a new concept that we talked about at a staff level, was real estate transfer tax. That's something that this group has not talked about historically as a source of funding for these activities, but you can link it to, it's a very good source of revenue. It's not necessarily as directly related to as utility tax, but it does have, it's certain, it's convenient, it's efficient, and it's neutral.
It's a percentage of the sales?
Yeah.
Price?
So from a stormwater perspective, this is, Bettina and Jeff, do you guys want to cover this?
Sure. So looking at some neighboring communities that have, or communities in Illinois that have a stormwater fee, it just gives you the general average cost per resident annually at $109, and I'm sorry, annually, and what that average comes to an estimated revenue. And these were taken from an excerpt of a stormwater feasibility study that the Village of Libertyville did recently.
So you can look at this and just say, okay, Tinley Park has a very small utility fee. That's odd. Well, how are they paying for that activity? Well, we don't know. We don't have the whole picture, but from a utility fee, that's what they're doing. Look at the opposite, Winnetka, who recently did this, and the idea that how much they're charging on average is the highest amount that we were able to find as part of our survey. But the idea is, most of the time, most communities don't design their fee. Like I said earlier in this presentation, the water rates aren't designed to capture 100% of the replacement cost, because you would probably drive people away because the fees are high, and it can be an issue. But again, as Bettina pointed out, using just these raw numbers, you can generate close to $250,000 in new revenues to help fund these activities.
Hey, Drew, can I just ask a question on
Yeah.
that last slide? Are those the only North Shore communities that are listed up there that are doing a stormwater utility tax? Winnetka, Highland Park? I guess Libertyville kind of, right?
Lincolnshire is having the conversation. Deerfield's just starting a conversation. I don't know about Glencoe's non-home ruled. I don't think they have stormwater utility. We can get more. We can get more information. Do a broader survey.
Drew, that number of 225,000 for Lake Bluff, that would be a proposed number if we,
That's just taking the average.
Just taking the average,
Oh.
not tying to any specific. We can come up with a formula, you
Yeah.
know, and part of this is, you know, this is one of those where would have been rated not necessarily convenient, because you're supposed to go back and revisit that, or efficient, because you have to go back and analyze it periodically, because people's impervious surface change. So you need to go back and go back and look at that periodically, so it's not.
This is for everyone too. I think it's important to point out, this isn't just for residents. This includes all, the village, everybody, anybody here. So the burden from that makes it look like it falls on residents. But Lincolnshire and Libertyville it's very equitable, because the commercial entities have way more
Impervious surface.
impervious surface, but like Winnetka's, so it's a multiplier, Winnetka's multiplier is $22. Somebody else, like Elburn, I think is $2. So it's all over the place, but Winnetka's deep tunnel project came in at an enormous number. So, I don't know what they're trying to fund with this, but I think we have a lot of leeway in terms of coming up with that factor, that number,
Right.
multiplier, whatever you want to call it.
Well, I think what we've illustrated is that the needs are numerous and vast. I think that's part of, what we're illustrating. And you can kind of break it up into little subsets of things that are geographically together and that would make sense to do in terms of the scale and the efficiencies to do at a certain point in time. But over and over again, we're seeing millions plus millions plus millions, and these millions need those millions, or else you're just building a bridge to nowhere.
Yep.
Right? And so, this very clearly illustrates that. And the stormwater utility, we've talked about it. It's not something that can be implemented quickly. The conversation has gone on a while, and our goal is to get this going, but, we've got a long timeline in terms of what it's going to take to get us there. So do we have any type of, realistic, how can we keep the conversation not only going, but like move it down the field so that we can,
I'll get there.
okay.
Okay.
So the other issue, one thing, if you've been around local government long enough, you know that there's an ebb and flow and more, I guess, waning, if you will, of utility fees, or I'm sorry, let me be clear. Revenue sources change over time, right? So like MFT is reducing due to the increase of electric vehicles in the marketplace. And so various taxes become less effective over time, just depending on what happens in the universe. So the idea of perhaps the village would approach this issue and say, we want to diversify revenue streams to try to solve this problem. So this was one, again, another idea is, I guess, another leg of support for the real estate transfer tax is one, as you can see, doing a standard, $3 per thousand generates a vast revenue source that the village could use to help fund this. As a point of reference, if the village wanted to borrow $10 million, the debt service could be easily satisfied between that number. And Bettina, would it be that number alone?
Yeah, it would be about $500,000.
Yeah, so the idea of just a scale of a bond, $10 million, you could take that number, and so the village could have, great variety, in terms of, what, does it want to go 3 per thousand, 5 per thousand? You can pick a different number. It could be lower, it could be more. But the idea is that generally, most of them are anywhere from $3 to $5 per $1,000 with the full actual purchase price. Likewise, going back to this number, you think about this number comes close to satisfying an annual debt service payment too on that size of bond. But I think what we've talked about internally is if the village picked out the scope of the project and looking at, the trunk is the key to all this, if the village can find a way to do that, then you could attach those straws by using other sources of revenue that are going to become available. For example, the village has an economic incentive agreement with Target. That's going to go offline soon, in a few years. And so the village is going to realize more than $250,000 that it's not seeing today. And that's going to come into play, and that the village could use that to do these straws and build, and have a steady stream of an income to do that. And I think there's another, isn't there a bond coming off too, Bettina?
Not yet.
What year is that?
Oh, they're all years out, the bonds. we
But
just-
the idea is that other sources of revenue will pop up over time that the village can tap to keep buying into these other areas and completing these other improvements. So what we wanted to do in terms of your question, Chair Ankerman, was that we wanted to, one, introduce this topic and share that with everybody. This is kind of, and where we last left it, as Chair Ankerman said, is there was a lot of support for the stormwater utility fee. We hadn't gotten into the conversation about the real estate transfer tax, but procedurally, to establish a stormwater utility fee is not that difficult. And in terms of timing, although there's more planning that would need to be done in terms of the village nailing down here's what staff would recommend in terms of how we would approach this, and here's like a communication plan and kind of laying out an overall approach to this. I think the question is there still support to do that? Does that seem to make sense? Or if not, what other information or questions do you have before you start going down that path Same with this real estate transfer tax. I mean, what other data would you want to understand or know more about before staff spent resources analyzing that in greater detail to bring it back and say,
Well, the meeting that you guys had, I thought was super informational.
yeah,
All of us would need to hear that. I've done a lot of research on this, but I don't know that everybody
Yeah.
else might have done that.
Steve?
I mean, for me, I'd like to understand we have a $40 million problem. So this solves something annually, the real estate tax solves something annually. How do we build up to solve the whole problem? I'd like to know that.
yeah. So, and this is the other part of this, and I've had a conversation with President Charlot about this a lot. Like you said, we talk about this almost daily, about what are we doing for stormwater. And today we're on the phone with Congressman Schneider's office, State Senator Julie Morrison's office, Representative Bob Morgan's office, the county Stormwater Management Commission in Sandy Hart, and the Illinois Department of Transportation because of the Deep Tunnel project. And we were talking, how can we do this, given that, this asset is, the IDOT is a principal in this solution in our eyes. And we went to them, and long story short is we don't have any money. And, but the county talked about some availability of funds in the neighborhood of $2.5 million that we could possibly qualify for our next round of funding, that they talked, I say, fairly supportive of. Our project qualifies, they liked it. And we talked about having a sidebar conversation with IDOT. IDOT knows that 24-inch pipe there that goes out from the viaduct, they know it's not the forever solution. They know they need to do something. And I think there's some willingness to be involved financially. It's just how far and what they're willing to do. And the big part of this, how patient is everybody going to be, right? This is not a new problem, right? This is a long-standing problem. And who has the I guess, courage and patience to see it through,
Right.
Especially since it is the spine that the village needs to do to solve the other problems. And
Right.
so I think there's different solution sets in the problem, but I think there's a big part of it where the village is probably borrowing funds to build the trunk and hopefully having a strong partner with the state and the county and maybe the feds, although I'm not too optimistic on that, but the idea is that is the trunk that gets built, and then again, those other sources of revenue pay for the straws over time. I think that was kind of the global conversation that we've had to date. I don't know if you have more.
Absolutely. Basically the viaduct is $17 million. In a perfect world, they would pay for it and would be left paying for the straws in our community. Okay, and the straws might be reaching to, you say 40, Steve. I really don't know what the number is, but the basic point is the state says, well, we'll not give you more than 3.5, and saying that is their negotiation stance. Okay. So now we have to go back and Drew will have a further conversation with IDOT. $17 million is, our budget is $10 million or $11 million. So $17 million is a year and a half, 2 years of budget and of course we cannot afford that. We're not gonna put also that on residents as a tax. This just doesn't make sense. So we need to be creative. So now is a game, to Drew's point, it's a game of negotiation. Okay, but we need to do that. To Kate's point, people are getting flooded. So the point is, we are here, we're gonna get this done. Okay?
So we're discussing this evening, these two revenue sources, the stormwater utility tax and the transfer tax. And the transfer tax, I would imagine in comparing us to Lake Forest has a transfer tax. But the real estate community would have something to say about that. And so that's something that we would really want to open up that discussion and, sorry, I have an alarm that's going off that I'm going to ignore. So that's something that we need to start that conversation early, because it sounds like great, it's an alternate source of revenue, but what does that really do down the line?
So the basic point is complementing what Drew was talking about. There is not one person is not going to pay $17 million. It's going to be a whole bunch of sources of revenue to actually go and try to foot the bill, plus the next bill that will be the straws into the deep tunnel. Okay, how do we do that? And that's what we decide here and what we negotiate to try to get as much as possible from the state.
Yes, so in terms of what you're looking for from the finance committee would be just kind of our, recommendation in terms of, do we want to pursue this idea of the transfer tax? This is the first time that we've talked about it at the committee level. And so I would look to the other committee members and other, board members who are here to just weigh in on that.
A couple of things. I think as to the real estate transfer tax, one thing you asked a few minutes ago was what else do we need? And I think Barbara just started on it. What do other communities do? If somebody is looking to purchase a home here or a home in Lake Forest, what is the cost benefit? Or, Libertyville, for example, are we somehow pricing ourselves out of some buyers? So comparable communities, I think, would be helpful. The other thing I wanted to ask, though, because I think I heard you say this, is that we need the trunk down North Avenue before the viaduct pours water. We can't build the viaduct first and then build North Avenue, or can we?
You have to work from the lake west.
Okay, so we know, even if we can get as creative as possible with the viaduct, we know we have to fund North Avenue, right?
Well, yes, and that is because even everything west of Sheridan Road and I guess east of Green Bay falls.
Right,
Right, yeah.
right.
All gets
So-
picked up there.
So there's no question but what we have to do. 72-inch pipe,
It's a monster.
it's a monster. Well, there's no question but that we have to do that pipe, and one might even say in a perfect world, we could do it while they're redoing that road right now, rather than do it and then redo it. But
Economies of scale.
I think we have to be planning now for North Avenue and not waiting for IDOT to come forward with money. It makes sense just realistically, but it also makes sense because as a matter of course, we have to do the east first,
Yeah,
right?
the next step would be a study. You want to talk about that, Jeff? We talked about pursuing WMB funds, grant funds for that study.
Yeah, the next step, we have a concept plan, but to start doing the actual
So
survey. and
that's the concept
engineering
plan.
To turn it into plans that we can shop for funding. The further along you are, it costs you money to get there, but you're better chance of getting grants as you're more construction ready, as things pop up.
So
So-
in terms of what I would imagine the finance committee might want to recommend, it would be an order of operations that we would really clearly lay out. This feeds that, and so this project needs to be done so that all others, kind of just laying out the straws. I mean, we can kind of generally see that that is the first thing that needs to be done, but lay it out with costs and then identify the potential funding sources, and it kind of just puts it all together. I mean, that, to me, seems like what we would like.
And we can do that, in combination with bringing Burke back to have the conversation specifically about stormwater.
Yes.
And that would be a good meeting, kind of size
Yes.
bite we can.
Yes, and then in terms of the transfer tax, I mean, it sounds like we just need to do a little bit more comparison to other, other municipalities. Joy?
I'd just like to say, when it comes with the taxes, the utility and the transfer, I'd like to see either or. I'm not comfortable with us enacting both of those. So, I mean, I know we need revenue streams. I know we can look at grants and bonds, and hopefully the state can somehow find us some money. But I don't know that I'm comfortable saying to residents, we're enacting a utility fee, and we're also now enacting a transfer tax. It just feels like,
I think we're
like
looking
a
at,
significant burden that we're.
well, I
putting
think
on
we're
people.
looking at options at this point to
Right, I
say,
mean, I'm not
it may
saying
be
we-
one
but-
or the other,
but,
right? And the other thing,
Talk about it almost more like
Yes.
an either or, not like, okay, now we're just gonna go forward with both. of these
well,
things.
I think the conversation might be a little bit premature. I think that we need
Right,
to
but I'm
explore
I
all
just
the
wanted to get it out
ways
on the
we can
table.
pay for it, but we don't know how we're gonna pay
Yeah.
for it. The state might come back with 20, great, awesome, or the state might come with 0, and guess what? We might not be able to do the project in the first place.
Yeah.
But at least, what are our options in front of us, and to what percentage will they contribute to funding the project, if there is a project?
Right.
What I think I heard Jeff say, though, is that it's best to have some construction-ready plans so that you can be ready to apply for grants. So I don't see a reason to delay getting plans ready for North Avenue.
So and to that point, I was going to bring we're going to get a proposal for professional services, show what that looks like, so you can have that to talk about at the next meeting, Steve.
Thank you.
I was just going to say to Joy's point, I agree with Joy, but the one thing about the stormwater utility fee is it's easy to sunset. I think a real estate transfer tax to have and then not would be odd, but with this, if we know we have a plan in place that's going to cost X, there can be a sunset provision in it. Whereas with the transfer tax, I don't know, you're right, I think you'd have to do a comparative analysis, but it just would be weird to have it and then not have it.
Well, and to think about it, and everybody who's here right now didn't pay the transfer tax. The transfer tax would be on when that property gets sold to whoever is moving in.
Right.
I mean, you know, it's different, it really is.
Yep, you are.
And this transfer tax is not as equitable versus the stormwater
That's
utility
right.
fee would be, when is Target gonna sell the building? 20 years from now? So there's an equity question there that I think is to Joy's point.
Okay, do you feel like you have direction?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
and the last item, we're running over, I don't know that we can get to it. I mean, unless we can speed talk in 1 minute, which we can't do. So, do I have a motion to adjourn the Finance Committee meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everyone. Sorry we ran over.
See, I'm paying attention, Drew.